I have doctored the bones of Hadley's Ford for 42 years, and if you want to know the truth of a town, you do not ask the preacher and you do not ask the mayor. You ask the man who has sat up with its dying and pulled its babies into the lamplight and stitched its fools after Saturday nights. That man learns what a place will forgive and what it will not, and I will tell you plain. The thing our town could not forgive, the summer Nora Ashcroft came to the Sabina, was a woman who did not need it. She rode in on a blood bay gelding the second week of June, leading 4 head on a string, and she did not ride side saddle. That was the first of it. A woman came up the river road astride, in a split canvas skirt gone the color of dust, a man's hat pushed back off a sunburnt face, and she sat that bay like she had been poured onto it. She stopped in front of Odell's Mercantile, swung down, hitched her string to the rail as neat as any drover, and went in and bought 40 pounds of oats and a sack of horseshoe nails, and paid for it out of her own purse with her own coin, and asked Odell straight where a body might rent pasture and a barn on the near side of the river. I was on the Mercantile porch with my coffee gone cold, and I watched the whole town rearrange its face around her the way a herd rearranges around a strange dog. Not danger, just wrongness, a thing that did not fit the slot cut for it. "Widow Ashcroft," she said, when Odell asked her name to write in his book, and she said it like a fact and not an apology, and that was the second of it. A widow was supposed to arrive smaller than her grief. This one arrived the size of her whole self. Her man had been Tom Ashcroft, a horse trader out of the nations, and he had died of a burst appendix in a wagon 200 miles east while she held a rag to his mouth and cursed every doctor who was not there, and she had told me that herself later, without a wobble in it. She had buried him under a lone hackberry, and then she had done the thing that our town would spend the summer unable to stomach. She had gone on. She had kept his string and his ledger and his trade, and she had driven it west by herself because it was hers now, and she knew horses better than most men know their own children, and she meant to make her living the only way she had ever made it, buying sound animals cheap and selling them sound and dear, and looking a man in the eye while she did it. She took the old Prout place on the near bench, a fallen-down barn and 40 acres of good grass and a spring that ran cold all summer, and she paid Widow Prout cash for a year, and inside a month she had that barn back on its feet and a training pen fenced, and a dozen head grazing the bench, so you could see them from the ford like a scatter of copper and black against the green. Understand what the summer was so you understand the town. It was a fat green summer, the Sabina running full and cold off a late snow up in the Ansel breaks, the cottonwoods heavy, the cattle slick, the whole valley the kind of prosperous that makes people mean because they have leisure to be. When times are hard, a town has no strength to spare for judging. It was not hard that year. We had strength to spare and we spent it on her. The women started it, and I will not pretend otherwise, though the women did not finish it. Prudence Vickery, who was married to the freight agent and ran the Ladies' Aid and the Sunday School, and by a kind of unelected divine right, the moral weather of Hadley's Ford, was the first to put words to what a good many were feeling. I heard her say it on the church steps, not lowering her voice, because lowering the voice would have implied she thought she might be wrong. "A woman," Prudence said, "who does business with men, alone on her own place, and laughs at their jokes." She let it sit. "I don't say what she is, I say what she'll be taken for." There is a particular cruelty in that construction, and I have heard it my whole life, and it never grows a new shape. I don't say what she is. I only repeat what she'll be taken for. It lets a person light the fire and stand back and say she never struck a match. By July, there were 3 or 4 such fires burning low and steady around Nora Ashcroft, and the smoke of them had begun to do her real harm, and she did not know the half of it, because she was a straight-dealing woman, and it did not occur to her that a town would knife her for the crime of being unafraid. She traded well. That was another sin. Men came out to the Prout bench to buy a saddle horse or sell a green colt, and they came expecting to skin a widow, and they went home skinned themselves, cheerful about it because she had done it fair and to their faces. She would run a hand down a horse's leg and tell a man his gelding was over at the knee and worth $8 less than he was asking, and she would be right, and she would give him the $8 off her own price on the next one to keep him coming back, and the men liked her the way men like a straight scale. They liked her, and they went home to wives who had spent the morning at the Ladies' Aid, and there is nothing a certain kind of household cannot turn to poison given a supper table and a grievance. I doctored her for a horse cut on her forearm the last week of July, a clean gash from a colt that spooked into a rail, and while I stitched it she talked, because she was a talker when the mood took her and she had had nobody to talk to for weeks but horses. She told me about Tom and the hackberry, and she told it dry-eyed but not cold, and I understood then that she was not the hard woman the town had decided on. She was a grieving woman who had refused to let her grief make her small, which is a different thing entirely and a braver one, and which our town was too coarse to tell apart. "They think I don't hear it," she said, watching the needle. "The talk." "You hear it." "I hear all of it, Doc." She smiled a little, and it did not reach up into her eyes. "I heard it in the last 3 towns, too. It's the same everywhere, word for word, like they all learned it out of the one book." She flexed her hand as I tied off. "A woman alone who does all right, that's the whole of my crime. If I was starving on the county, they'd have a supper collection up for me by Sunday and call me a saint. It's the doing all right they can't abide." I have thought about that sentence for 40 years, and I have not improved on it. The one who turned the low fire into a house fire was Roland Skeff, and here I have to be careful, because it would be easy to make Skeff a black-hatted villain, and he was not, which is worse. He was the banker's son, a soft-handed, well-spoken young man of good coat and better prospects, and he had a way of standing in a doorway like he had bought the doorway. He fancied himself Hadley's Ford's finest catch, and by the town's own accounting he was, and when he set his hat for the horse-trading widow he did it fully expecting to be thanked. He courted her the way a man courts a thing he has already decided is his. He brought store candy and a bolt of yard goods, and a great deal of talk about what a woman in her position needed, which was, as it turned out, exactly a man in his position. He came out to the bench 3 Sundays running in a hired buggy, and the 3rd Sunday he made his offer, and I have it from Nora herself how she answered, and I believe her, because she never once told me a thing to make herself look better than she was. "I told him no, Doc," she said, "and I told him kind. I said I was flattered and I wasn't looking to wed, and I had a trade that suited me and a name I meant to keep, and I thanked him for the candy." She shook her head. "You'd have thought I spit on his boots." A man like Skeff cannot hold 2 ideas at once, that he is the county's finest catch, and that a dusty horse widow looked at him plain and said no thank you. One of those ideas has to go, and it is never the flattering one. So the other one changed shape. She had not refused him, she had insulted him. And an insult in a man built the way Skeff was built curdles fast into a need to prove the insulter worthless, because if she is worthless then her no is not a wound but a mercy he escaped. He began to talk, softly at first and cleverly in the way that does the most damage. He never said an outright thing you could make him answer for. He would let his face fall at the mention of her and say he'd rather not repeat what he'd seen out at that place. He would allow, sadly, that he had thought better of her before he'd learned a few things. He never said what things. He didn't have to. The town, primed all summer, filled the silence with the very worst it could invent, and then remembered the invention as something Skeff had told it, and then repeated it as gospel. And by the 2nd week of August, there was not a supper table in Hadley's Ford where it was not simply known that the widow on the Prout bench was a woman of low character who had come to the Sabina to ply an old trade in a new pasture. None of it was true. I want that on the record in a doctor's plain hand. Not one word of it was true. I had stitched her arm and sat in her kitchen, and I would have staked my license on her, and it would not have mattered, because a town in the grip of that particular fever does not want evidence. It wants the story. The story is more satisfying than she was. The harm came fast once it took. Odell's wife let it be known she'd as soon not have the widow's custom, and Odell, who was a decent man and a coward, began to find his stock of oats mysteriously spoken for whenever Nora came in. The preacher, a well-meaning gray man named Halloway, preached a Sunday sermon on the wandering woman of Proverbs that named no names and needed none. 2 men who had been fixing to buy horses from her didn't come. Then 4. Then the word got out to the neighboring places, carried on the freight road, and a widow whose whole living depended on men trusting her word suddenly found that a good third of the county had decided her word was worth nothing, on the strength of a thing nobody could quite say they'd witnessed. She did not run. I watched for it and it did not come. She squared her shoulders and cut her prices to keep the trade she had left and worked from Cancy to Cancy, and she rode into town with her chin up and paid cash and said good morning to women who looked through her like glass, and she did not give the town the satisfaction of watching her break. But I am a doctor, and I know what it costs a body to hold a spine straight against that kind of weather. She was losing weight. There was a night behind her eyes that had not been there in June. She was doing all right, still, out of pure grit, and the town was working hard and patient to make sure that by winter she wouldn't be, because it could not stand her doing all right, and it had finally found a way to fix that. That was where matters stood the morning Gideon Hale rode down to the Prout bench to buy a horse. I should tell you about Gideon Hale before I tell you what he did, because what he did only matters if you understand who he was. Hale had the Curlew, a horse ranch up the Sabina where the river bent back on itself, and he bred and broke the best stock in 3 counties, and every man who had ever bought an animal off him had gotten exactly what Hale said he was getting, no better and never worse. He was near 50 that summer, a big, unhurried, weather-cured man who moved like he'd never once been in a hurry in his life, and never once been late either. He had buried his wife Margaret 9 years before. A fever took her in a week, and I was there for all 7 days of it and could do nothing, and Gideon never held it against me, which is more grace than most men have, and he had not remarried and did not court and had, so far as the town knew, simply folded his heart up small and put it away with her things. Here is the thing about Gideon Hale that you must understand. He was the most trusted man in the county, and he had come by that trust the only honest way, which is a lifetime of never spending it. When there was a dispute over a fence line or a brand or a debt, it was Hale they asked to settle it, both sides, because both sides knew he would call it straight even against his own friend. When the bank threatened old Prout's widow over a note, it was Hale who quietly bought the note and tore it up and never mentioned it. He gave no sermons and joined no committees, and Prudence Vickery could not run him because there was no soft place in the man to get a grip on. He simply was, out at the Curlew, a fixed point, and a town orients on a fixed point whether it means to or not. He had heard the talk about the widow, of course, everyone had. And he had done with it what he did with all talk, which was set it aside as none of his affair, until the morning he needed a particular kind of horse, and heard the widow had a particular kind of horse, and rode down to buy it, because a good horse was a good horse, and Gideon Hale did not let a town supper gossip come between him and a sound animal. I happened to be there. I had ridden out to change the dressing on her arm, and I was on the porch when Hale came up the lane on a rangy gray, and I saw Nora come out of the barn wiping her hands and go still when she saw who it was, the way you go still when you can't yet tell if a thing is another blow or not. "Ma'am," Hale said and touched his hat, "heard you've got a bay mare, deep-chested, 3 white feet. Broke to harness and saddle both." "I do," Nora said, careful, waiting for the catch. I'd look at her. She brought the mare out, and Hale got down and went over that horse the way one horseman lets another know he's a horseman, quiet, thorough, hands that ask questions and wait for the answers. He picked up each foot. He ran a thumb down the tendons. He looked in her mouth and put his ear to her chest and walked her out and back and watched her move, and Nora stood with her arms crossed and let him, because she knew exactly what her horse was and had nothing to hide. "She's got a splint coming on the near fore," Hale said finally, straightening. "Old one cold won't trouble her, but it's there." "It's there," Nora agreed. "I'd have showed you before you bought. I'd have took $2 off for it." Hale looked at her then, really looked for the first time, and I saw something move behind his face. He had come expecting either a hard-faced schemer or a fallen woman, because that is what he'd been handed, and what he'd found instead was a horse trader who volunteered a flaw and docked her own price for it before he'd asked. There is no faster way to a man like Gideon Hale's respect. He had spent his whole life being the only straight dealer in the room. He had just met another one. $2 off the splint," he said. "I won't take it. Splint like that's a $2 splint on a paper, not on a horse doing work." "I'll pay your asking." "Then you'll pay $2 too much," Nora said, "and I'll not have it said the widow overcharged Gideon Hale. Take the 2 off or I don't sell." And Gideon Hale, the most trusted man in the county, who had never in living memory been argued down on a horse, took the $2 off, because she'd made it a point of honor and he could see she meant it, and he paid her out of a worn poke and counted it into her hand, and then he stood there a moment longer than the transaction required. "They've been telling it wrong about you," he said. It was not a question. He was a man who dealt in what he could see with his own eyes, and he had just seen it. Nora's chin came up. "You'd know better than the whole town, would you, on one horse?" "I'd know a straight dealer on one horse," Hale said. "I've bought 1,000 of 'em, takes about that long." He gathered the mare's lead. "The rest of it's none of my business, but I don't like a thing told wrong, sticks in me." He touched his hat again. "Ma'am, Doc." And he rode out leading the bay mare at the same unhurried walk he'd come in on, like a man who had all day and had done nothing more remarkable than buy a horse. He had done a great deal more than buy a horse. I knew it standing on that porch, and Nora knew it, though neither of us could have said yet what. He had walked into the middle of a town's decision, and with a single sentence declined to make it his own. "They've been telling it wrong about you." In a place where every soul was busy telling it right, that is, telling it the way that flattered themselves, Gideon Hale had looked at the evidence and called it straight, the way he called everything straight, and it did not occur to him to do otherwise. And that, God help the town, was going to cost it dearly, because you cannot have your one fixed point disagree with you and go on pretending you were never wrong. Nora watched him out of sight. "Why'd he do that?" she said. "Not to me, to the road." I did not have an answer for her then. I have one now, and it is simple, and it is the whole of the story. Some men, when they see a straight thing being called crooked, feel it in their bones like a splinter and cannot rest until it is put right. Gideon Hale was one of those. He had just gotten his splinter. He came back the next week for a colt he didn't need. I know he didn't need it because he told me so himself, years later, laughing at himself the way he'd learned to. "I had 30 head of my own," he said, "and I rode 8 miles to buy a green colt off a woman who'd already sold me a mare. I told myself it was the colt. He hadn't gone for the colt. He'd gone because he'd spent a week with a splinter in him, and because a straight-dealing widow being knifed by liars had settled somewhere under his ribs and would not settle, and because, though it would be another month before he'd say the word even to himself, a light had come on in a house that had stood dark for 9 years, and a man will invent a great many colts to sit near that light. They dealt. That was how it started, and I think it is the reason it lasted, because it started on the one ground where they were exactly equal. She never once in all of it deferred to him. She argued him down on a colt and up on a saddle, and she told him to his face when he was wrong about a horse's wind, and she was right, and he took it. And I believe it was the first time in his adult life a man like Gideon Hale had been contradicted by someone he couldn't dismiss and found he liked it better than being agreed with. Margaret had been a gentle soul and he had loved her true, but he had spent 9 years since being deferred to by a whole county, and here was a sunburnt widow who'd sooner spit than defer, and it woke him up like cold river water. He got in the habit of Sundays. He'd ride down of a Sunday afternoon, and they'd walk the fence line looking at stock, and she'd have coffee on, and I'd sometimes be there and sometimes not, and there was never one thing in it that the meanest tongue in Hadley's Ford could have called improper, and the meanest tongue in Hadley's Ford called it improper anyway, because by now the town had too much invested in her wickedness to let a little thing like Gideon Hale's courtship stand in its way. Except, and here is where it turned, Gideon Hale's courtship was not a little thing. Skeff's whispers about the widow had cost her trade and standing, but they had cost the town nothing, because to agree with Skeff was free and easy and flattering. To go on agreeing with Skeff now meant setting yourself against Gideon Hale, and that was not free. That cost. The whole architecture of the slander had rested on the town's certainty that no decent, respected man would touch her. Every supper-table verdict had that certainty as its foundation. And now the most decent, most respected man in the county was riding down to her place every Sunday in plain daylight, and the foundation was cracking, and you could feel the town start to panic. Prudence Vickery came to see me about it, which tells you how rattled they were, because Prudence Vickery did not consult doctors, she diagnosed for herself. She sat in my office and worked her way around to it. "You're out there," she said. "At the Prout place." I doctored her arm. "You could speak to Gideon Hale." "About what?" Prudence pressed her lips. "He's a widower 9 years and lonely and not himself, and that woman has got her hooks in a good man, and somebody who has his ear ought to." "Prudence," I said, "I have doctored this town since before you were married, and I will tell you the one thing I know for certain. Gideon Hale has never in his life not been himself. There is no more himself a man can be. Whatever he's doing out there, he's doing with both eyes open and his own good reasons, and there is not a soul alive who can talk him out of a thing he's decided is straight." I set down my pen. "You'd do better to ask yourself why it frightens you so, a good man liking her. If she were what you've all decided she is, he'd never have looked twice. He's the surest judge of a sound thing in this county. What does it say that he judged her sound?" She left angry, but I had put the splinter in her too, whether she'd own it or not, and it is a fact worth setting down that some of the town, not the loudest, but the quietest and the most honest of them, began about then to feel the first cold draft of a suspicion that they had been wrong, and that Gideon Hale, who was never wrong about a sound thing, had seen it before they had. Skeff felt the ground shifting under him faster than anyone, because he had the most to lose. His whole recovery from the humiliation of that no thank you had been built on making Nora worthless, and now the county's best man was steadily, wordlessly proving her worth, and every Sunday Hale rode down that lane it undid a little more of Skeff's work, and Skeff was not the kind to lose gracefully what he had lost so ungracefully before. So he did the thing that finally broke it open, and it was the worst thing, and it was a lie built to look like proof, because whispers had stopped being enough. 2 of Skeff's father's horses went missing from the bank's paddock on a Thursday night in September. Good horses, blooded, worth real money. And on Friday morning it was discovered, mind, with witnesses conveniently to hand, that both animals had turned up in the widow Ashcroft's own pasture on the Prout bench, grazing bold as brass among her string. The town had its proof, not gossip now, horses, stolen horses in the wicked widow's field, and everyone had always said, hadn't they, that a woman like that would come to it. The sheriff, a decent enough plotter named Alt, rode out Friday noon to arrest her, and half of Hadley's Ford rode out behind him to watch, and I was among them because I had a black feeling in my chest, and I did not want that woman to face it alone. She faced it standing in her own yard, straight-backed, with the 2 blooded horses cropping grass behind her as good as a hangman's rope, and she looked at the crowd and at Alt, and she did not run, and she did not weep, and she did not even then plead. She said, "I did not steal those horses. I don't know how they came here. I woke and they were in my field, and I sent my boy to town to report it not 1 hour ago. Ask at the sheriff's, and I'll swear it on anything you name." And nobody believed her, because the town did not want to, and Alt had his duty, and it would have ended right there. The widow in the county jail on a stealing charge that would have finished her trade and her name and maybe her neck. Except that Gideon Hale rode down the lane and through the crowd and got off his horse in her yard and turned around and looked at the whole of Hadley's Ford. And the town went quiet, because when the fixed point moves, everything holds its breath. "Anybody here," Gideon Hale said, "in a hurry to hang a woman ought to take a minute first and look at the horses." He walked over to the two blooded animals, unhurried as ever, and he picked up the near fore of the first one and looked at the shoe. And then he called the town's own blacksmith, Emil Brandt, out of the crowd by name. "Emil, you shoe the bank stock." "I do," said Brandt uneasy. "You shod these two?" "Tuesday last." "Come look then," Hale said, "and tell these people whose nails those are and whose clinch." Brandt came because he could not come, and he bent to the hoof, and I watched his face change. "And while you're down there," Hale went on, mild as milk, "you tell him how far it is from the bank paddock to this bench, and whether a horse walks that in a night and comes up clean-legged with no dew off the river on him and no burr in his tail from the bottoms he'd have to cross. Because I looked at these two coming in and there's no travel on 'em. No mud past the fetlock. No sweat dried under the mane. These horses were led here gentle in a trailer or walked the county road in daylight and turned into this field by hand not 6 hours gone. They did not stray here and they did not run here in the dark." He straightened and looked at the crowd. "A horse tells you where he's been if you'll trouble to read him. These two been standing in a clean paddock and rode here in comfort. Somebody put 'em in this field on purpose in the last little while, and I'd guess did it careful so's to be found." The silence was a different silence now. Brandt stood up slow and said, in a voice that carried, "Those are my nails, Tuesday's clinch, and Gideon's right about the legs. These horses ain't traveled." And into that silence Gideon Hale did the thing that I have never forgotten, and that I set down here as the truest act of plain courage I ever witnessed in a long life of watching men fail at courage. He did not shout. He did not accuse Skeff, though he knew and I knew, and by the shifting of the crowd a good many were beginning to know. He simply said quietly, to the whole town at once, "I've bought and sold with this woman since June. I've dealt with her a dozen times. She's told me a splint I'd have missed and docked her own price for a flaw before I asked, and argued me down on my own horse and been right. In 30 years of trading I have met 3 people I'd take a horse from sight unseen on their bare word, and she's the third, and the other 2 are dead. I'll tell you what she is, since the whole county's been so free telling it. She's the straightest dealer on this river, and she's a widow keeping her man's trade alive by herself with the whole town's boot on her neck, and she's more honest asleep than the man who staged this is awake. And any of you that helps hang her on this'll answer to me for it. Not with a gun, I'm too old and it's beneath the both of us, but you'll answer, because I'll know, and I don't forget a crooked thing, and neither does this county remember it forever who called it crooked and who called it straight." He turned to Nora then, and his voice came down soft, only for her, though we all heard it in that stillness. "You didn't need me to say it," he said. "I know you didn't. You'd have stood here and told 'em the truth till they jailed you and it'd still have been the truth. But I wasn't going to stand up the river and let a straight thing be called crooked. Sticks in me. Always has." He almost smiled. "You told me that yourself about the town, said the doing all right was your whole crime. I've thought on it a month. It's the finest true thing anybody's said to me since Margaret died. I will not tell you the town confessed all at once, because towns do not. But Sheriff Alt took the 2 horses and did not take the woman, and he rode to the bank instead of the jail and asked some questions, and by the following week it had come out not from Skeff, who never once admitted a thing, but from a hired man he'd paid, who wouldn't hang for a banker's son, how the horses had come to be in the widow's field, and why, and who had thought of it. Skeff was not tried, because his father was the bank, and that is how it goes, but he left the county before the leaves were down and did not come back, and Hadley's Ford, which cannot say sorry to save its soul, said it's sorry the only way a town can, which is by slowly, shamefacedly, deciding it had never really believed the story anyhow. Odell's oats came back into stock. Men rode out to the bench to buy horses again, more than before, some of them out of guilt and all of them staying for the straight dealing. Prudence Vickery never apologized and never would, but she was seen, that autumn, to nod to Nora Ashcroft on the church steps, which from Prudence Vickery was the same as falling on her knees. The fever broke the way fevers break, all at once and with a kind of exhausted shame, and the town got well. He asked her in November, and he did it wrong, and I love the story better for it. He rode down of a Sunday and they walked the fence like always, and I had it after from both of them, their two versions matching in every particular, which is how you know a thing is true. He got to the corner post and stopped and looked at the stock a while, and then he said, not looking at her, "I've been thinking a man out at the Curlew's got more grass than he's using, and you've got more stock than that bench'll winter, and it'd be a sensible arrangement to run 'em together." Nora let that sit. Then she said, "Are you offering me pasture, Gideon Hale, or are you offering me something and dressed it up as pasture because you forgot how to do the other?" And Gideon Hale, the most trusted man in the county, went red as a boy and took off his hat and said, "I forgot how to do the other. Margaret's been gone 9 years and I never thought I'd want to remember, but I'd like to marry you, Nora, if you'll have me, and I've got to say the rest of it plain or I'll not sleep. I'm not offering to save you. You don't need saving, you never did, that was the whole town's mistake and I won't make it. I'm not asking you to quit your trade, nor take my name if you'd sooner keep your own. You'll deal your horses under your own hand as long as you please and I'll not say a word, but that's a fine horse. I'm asking because in June I bought a mare off you and got told a straight thing after 9 years of getting told easy things, and I've not had a Sunday since worth a damn that I didn't spend down this lane. That's the whole of it. That's all I've got. I'd count it the luck of my life if you'd have me." Nora Ashcroft looked at him a long moment, and I am told by her that what she was weighing was not whether she wanted him, which she'd known for a month, but whether she could marry a man and stay entirely herself, because she had built a self out of grief and grit that no town could break, and she would not hand it over even to a good man for anything less than a promise she believed. And Gideon Hale had just made her exactly that promise, plainly unasked, because he'd understood her the way he understood a sound horse, all the way through, and prized what he found. "I'll keep my name," she said. "Keep it, and my trade, and my say in it. And I'll argue you down on horses in front of God and everybody and be right." "You will," Hale said, "and it's my favorite thing about you, and I'd not have you any other way." "Then yes," said Nora. "Yes, Gideon, and it's the sensiblest arrangement I ever heard, running our stock together." And she was crying and laughing both, which she'd have died before doing in front of the town, and she did it in front of him, which is the whole difference, and which is the closest thing to a definition of the word home that I have ever been able to arrive at. They married in the church at Hadley's Ford in December, before the whole town, the same town, the identical town, that had wanted to hang her in September, because Gideon Hale would not have it done quiet in a parlor as though there were still one thing to be ashamed of. He married her in daylight before them all, the most trusted man in the county taking the straightest dealer on the river to wife, and he made the town watch, and the town came, and the town wept, some of it out of real gladness and some of it out of the particular relief of people forgiven for a thing they'd never confessed. Preacher Halloway, who had once preached the wandering woman of Proverbs at her, married them, and had the grace to look ashamed doing it, and Nora had the grace not to make him feel it, which was more grace than the town had shown her, and she knew it and she showed it anyway. And that, more than anything Skeff or Prudence Vickery ever did, was the measure of the woman. She wore her own dress, plain and clean, and she came up the aisle astride nothing, on her own 2 feet, and gave herself away, because there was no man living had the right to give away Nora Ashcroft, and everyone in that church understood it, and it was the truest wedding I ever stood witness at. I am an old man now, older than Gideon lived to be. He went 12 years back in his sleep at the Curlew, an old horseman worn out honest, and I signed the paper, and it was the hardest one I ever signed. The town he'd faced down turned out for him 3 deep, and half of them had forgotten they'd ever wanted to hang his wife, and I did not remind them because he wouldn't have, and I have tried in my old age to be a little more like him and a little less like the town. Nora is out at the Curlew still, near 80 now and straight-backed as the day she rode in astride a blood bay and scandalized a valley by doing all right. She keeps a few head yet, and she'll still tell you a splint you'd have missed and dock her own price for it. And last week when I rode out to look in on her, for I doctor her yet, 40 years on, and it is the honor of my practice, I found her at the corral in the low gold light of evening, one hand on the rail, watching a young sorrel she'd been gentling move loose and easy across the pen. "He's coming along," she said, not turning. She always knew my step. "He is," I said, and stood beside her at the rail, 2 old creatures in the last of the sun, and we watched the horse a while and said nothing, which is what you earn, if you live long enough and honest enough, the right to do beside somebody, to stand at a rail and say nothing and have it be full. The town called her too bold to wed. I heard them say it with my own ears, that fat green summer, and I have outlived every mouth that said it. And she stands yet at her own corral rail in the gold of the evening, on her own place, under her own name, watching a horse she made sound with her own 2 hands, the straightest dealer on the Sabina, the finest woman the county was ever nearly too small to keep. And the man who saw it first is up under the hackberry she planted for him on the rise, where she can look at him from the porch of an evening, and where one day, not soon I hope, but one day, she means to lie down beside him. Having done all right, all her life long, to the very end, and let no town on this earth make her the least bit sorry for it.